In the trembling silence before dawn on June 6, 1944, a ripple of hope and dread spread across stormy seas and cold beaches in northern France. The world was caught on the edge of a knife. Years of brutal conflict had marred blood and soil, and now, the greatest military gamble in modern history was about to unfold. But few outside the Allied High Command understood that Normandy's fate would be decided not only by men and machines, but by shadows and illusions. The creation of Operation Fortitude, the heart of the Allies' deception campaign, began months before the actual D-Day landings. Allied leaders faced an unyielding problem. With limited resources, they needed to breach Hitler's formidable Atlantic Wall, yet they could not do so head-to-head. The German High Command, vigilant and ruthless, watched for any sign of invasion. If the Nazis guessed the real target too soon, they would hurl the full might of their panzer divisions against the beachheads, wiping out the Allied assault before it could gain ground. So the Allies turned to cunning. Through a combination of intelligence, genius, and sheer audacity, they conceived a plan to mislead their enemy in a way the world had never seen. The origins of Operation Fortitude lay with the London Controlling Section, led by masterminds like John Bevan and Colonel David Strangeways. Their idea was simple yet perilous: create phantom armies, manufacture fake equipment, unleash an army of double agents and cryptographers, and build up a legend so convincing that even Hitler himself would trust the lie. Fortitude was divided into two braids. Fortitude North would threaten an invasion of Norway, but the real sword was Fortitude South, which would convince the Germans that the Allies planned to land at the Pas de Calais, the narrowest point between England and France, and the most logical invasion path. George S. Patton, revered by friend and feared by foe, was appointed to command the fictitious 1st U.S. Army Group, FUSAG, stationed in southeast England with an array of rubber tanks, plywood landing craft, and fake airfields attended by actors and small real support crews. Even local villagers became unwitting extras in history's greatest masquerade. Behind the stage, the cryptanalysts at Bletchley Park, working under the Ultra Project, had cracked the German Enigma codes. This gave the Allies a superhuman advantage. They could monitor the reaction to every planted rumor and every coded message. By steering their double agents, most famously Juan Pujol Garcia, codenamed Garbo, the Allies served up a steady diet of misinformation to Berlin. Garbo's web of fictional subagents became so trusted that the Germans paid for reports about troop movements, logistics, and intentions, all of which came straight from British intelligence. As D-Day approached, tension mounted. In Kent, roads, bridges, and entire villages appeared to blossom with military activity, except most of it was engineered for German reconnaissance. The Allies allowed Luftwaffe pilots to photograph these areas from high above, making sure they saw what they needed to see. Under cover of night, real armies quietly relocated toward the south, toward Normandy, every movement draped in secrecy and confusion. Radio operators blasted out dummy communications, simulating the chatter of tens of thousands of men and trucks poised to strike at Calais. Even the movement of supply convoys was choreographed to suggest preparations for an assault elsewhere. But deception bears risks. Erwin Rommel, the legendary German field marshal entrusted with France's defense, was skeptical. In late May 1944, sharp analysis and gut feeling drove him to warn Berlin that the Allies could be headed for Normandy, since the coast was less fortified. His appeals for reinforcement went largely unheeded, a victory for Fortitude's architects, but also a testament to the tangled inertia of Nazi command. Hitler, the ultimate target, remained convinced, thanks to carefully groomed lies, that Normandy was a feint, a trap to draw German forces from Calais, where the real invasion would land. On June 5th, as paratroopers and commandos prepared for their fateful leap into history, a mock invasion at Dover tied up Nazi attention one last time. The following day, as Allied troops rushed onto Normandy's beaches under deadly fire, Hitler refused to send in reserves from Calais. For weeks he waited, expecting Patton's imaginary army to crash into Europe. By the time reality broke the spell, the Allies had secured a vital foothold that would lead, step by bloody step, to the liberation of Paris and the eventual collapse of the Third Reich. Operation Fortitude was more than a diversion. It was a transformation of warfare itself. What began as cardboard tanks and civilian misdirection evolved into a testament to the power of strategy over brute force. It proved that courage can wear many masks. Sometimes the most powerful weapon is belief, expertly crafted to blind the strongest adversary. The legacy of fortitude endures as a lesson in intelligence, creativity, and the quiet resolve of those who shape history from the shadows. The true genius of Operation Fortitude rested not in smoke and mirrors alone, but in the meticulous layering of believable details across every medium available to the Allies. The challenge was daunting. How do you convince an entire war machine, one led by paranoid generals and a dictator obsessed with betrayal, that an entirely fabricated threat is real? The answer lay in creating a world where fiction became indistinguishable from fact, where even the smallest thread of evidence supported the grand lie. At the heart of Fortitude South stood the 1st U.S. Army Group, or FUSAG, an army that existed only in German imagination and Allied planning rooms. FUSAG was supposedly massed in southeast England, poised to strike across the narrowest part of the English Channel toward Pas-de-Calais. To make this phantom force credible, the Allies constructed an elaborate theater of war. In Kent and Sussex, fields filled with inflatable Sherman tanks, rubber creations so realistic from the air that Luftwaffe reconnaissance planes photographed them as genuine armor. Wooden and canvas gliders lined fake airstrips. Dummy landing craft bobbed in harbors, meticulously positioned to suggest imminent departure. Engineers even built false oil storage depots and encampments, complete with laundry, lines, and vehicle tracks. But props alone would not fool a sophisticated enemy. The Allies understood that the Germans would scrutinize radio traffic, a critical source of intelligence. So Allied signal units transmitted thousands of fake messages, simulating the communications chatter of entire divisions preparing for invasion. Operators followed strict protocols, mimicking the patterns and rhythms of real military networks. They created fictional supply requests, movement orders, and coordination between non-existent units. German listening posts dutifully intercepted these transmissions, feeding them into intelligence reports that climbed the chain of command all the way to Berlin. The placement of General George S. Patton as FUSAG's commander elevated the deception from plausible to irresistible. Patton, with his ivory-handled revolvers and aggressive battlefield tactics, had earned a fearsome reputation in North Africa and Sicily. German intelligence considered him the most dangerous Allied general, the one man capable of executing a lightning strike into occupied Europe. When Patton appeared publicly in southeast England, inspecting non-existent troops and giving speeches, German spies took note. The message was clear. Wherever Patton went, the main blow would fall. The Allies exploited this perception ruthlessly, ensuring Patton remained visible in the southeast, even as the real invasion forces gathered in secret further west. The human dimension of fortitude proved equally critical. The double-cross system, run by MI5's 20 Committee, had achieved something extraordinary. It had turned virtually every German agent in Britain into a double agent working for the Allies. These individuals, often under threat of execution or motivated by ideology, fed a carefully controlled stream of intelligence back to their German handlers. The information they provided was a masterwork of calculated truth, mixed with strategic lies. Sometimes they reported genuine, but inconsequential facts to maintain credibility. Other times they delivered devastating falsehoods disguised as hard-won secrets. Juan Pujol Garcia, known by his codename Garbo, stood as the crown jewel of this network. A Spaniard with no formal intelligence training, Garbo had convinced German intelligence that he ran an extensive spy ring across Britain. In reality, every one of his supposed sub-agents was fictional, their reports invented in collaboration with British handlers. Garbo's messages were so convincing, his fabricated network so detailed, that the Germans trusted him implicitly. They even paid him for his services. In the weeks before D-Day, Garbo fed Berlin a steady diet of information about FUSAG's preparations, confirming German suspicions about Pas-de-Calais. His greatest performance, however, came after the invasion had already begun. On the night of June 5-6, 1944, as Allied paratroopers descended into Normandy's darkness and naval armadas crossed the Channel, the final act of tactical deception unfolded. Operation Titanic saw hundreds of dummy paratroopers, nicknamed Ruperts by the British, dropped far from the actual landing zones. These decoys were equipped with firecrackers and recording devices that simulated gunfire and shouting. A handful of Special Air Service soldiers jumped with the dummies, playing amplified recordings of battle sounds to sell the illusion. German commanders, already on edge, diverted precious reserves to investigate these. Phantom airborne assaults, pulling troops away from the real drop zones where American and British paratroopers were fighting for their lives. As dawn broke and Allied soldiers stormed the beaches of Normandy, The Germans remained convinced this was a feint. Intelligence reports from multiple sources, including Garbo, had prepared them for exactly this scenario. The real invasion, they believed, would come at Calais, led by Patton's massive army. Hitler himself fell for the deception. Despite pleas from field commanders who could see the scale of the Normandy assault, he refused to release panzer reserves stationed near Pas de Calais. The Führer would not be tricked by what he perceived as an obvious diversion. 3 days after the landings, Garbo sent what would become his most consequential message. In a lengthy transmission to his German handlers, he reported that most Allied forces remained in England, that the Normandy operation was indeed a diversion, and that Patton's Fusag was still poised to strike at Calais. The message arrived too late to prevent the initial landings, a calculated delay that maintained Garbo's credibility, but it was perfectly timed to paralyze German reinforcement decisions. Ultra-intercepts, the decoded German communications, confirmed that Berlin bought the story completely. German High Command issued orders to maintain defensive positions at Calais and limit troop transfers to Normandy. The deception held for 7 crucial weeks. During that time, Allied forces expanded their beachhead, captured Cherbourg's vital port, and broke out into the French interior. By the time German commanders realized Normandy was the true and only invasion, it was too late. The window for crushing the Allies on the beaches had closed. The Atlantic Wall, that supposedly impregnable fortress, had been breached not by overwhelming force, but by guile and patience. Less celebrated but equally important were the efforts to sell Fortitude North, the Operation's Norwegian component. Using the same playbook of phantom armies, dummy equipment, and false intelligence, the Allies convinced the Germans that a major assault on Norway was imminent. This forced Hitler to maintain hundreds of thousands of troops in Scandinavia, troops desperately needed elsewhere. The Fourth Army, supposedly based in Scotland, threatened landings around Narvik and Trondheim. Fake radio traffic, diplomatic theater involving neutral Sweden, and carefully planted rumors kept German attention fixed on the north throughout the crucial period. Behind the scenes, an army of unsung heroes made Fortitude possible. Engineers who designed inflatable tanks that could be transported by just a few men, yet looked authentic from altitude. Artists who created false insignia and unit patches. Carpenters who built plywood warships convincing enough to fool aerial photography. Radio operators who spent months transmitting meaningless but formatted messages. Local British citizens who were asked to keep silent about the strange activities in their villages, never knowing how their discretion contributed to victory. The operation also involved psychological manipulation on a grand scale. German POWs were carefully questioned, their responses analyzed to understand what would convince their commanders back home. Captured documents and intercepted communications revealed German expectations and fears, allowing Fortitude planners to tailor their deception. Accordingly, the Allies even staged elaborate scenes for the benefit of German prisoners about to be repatriated. General Hans Kramer, released from British custody just weeks before D-Day, was driven through southern England, where real invasion preparations were underway, but his escort deliberately mislabeled locations, changing road signs and casually mentioning place names in southeast England. Kramer, believing he had been driven through the Pas-de-Calais invasion staging area, rushed to inform his old colleague Rommel upon returning to Germany. His eyewitness testimony, coming from a trusted German general rather than a spy, carried immense weight. The technology of deception evolved alongside the operation. The Allies developed sonic deception techniques, using sound effects and loudspeakers to simulate tank formations and troop movements where none existed. They experimented with visual camouflage that could make real installations invisible, while making fake ones prominent. They created entire dummy headquarters, complete with guard posts, vehicle traffic, and communication antennas, all attended by skeleton crews, whose job was simply to maintain the illusion. Coordination across Allied intelligence services proved essential. British MI5 and MI6 worked alongside American OSS agents. Free French intelligence provided insights into German defensive thinking. Polish cryptographers contributed to breaking German codes. Canadian forces participated in elaborate training, exercises designed to be observed by German spies. The scale of cooperation was unprecedented, binding together disparate organizations in service of a single, audacious lie. The risks were enormous. If the Germans had discovered even a fraction of the deception, they could have unraveled the entire operation. A single captured double agent revealing his true allegiance could have compromised the whole network. A Luftwaffe pilot flying low enough to spot rubber tanks might have exposed the fake armies. An Enigma message mentioning Allied deception could have alerted German intelligence that their codes were compromised. Yet somehow, despite thousands of moving parts and hundreds of people involved, the secret held. Part of this success came from understanding the enemy's mindset. German intelligence, like most intelligence services, tended to see what it expected to see. When evidence confirmed their preconceptions about an Allied landing at Calais, they accepted it eagerly. When contradictory evidence appeared, they rationalized it away. The Allies exploited this cognitive bias ruthlessly, feeding German analysts a diet of information that aligned with their assumptions, while subtly discrediting anything that might reveal the truth. The role of Ultra, the intelligence derived from breaking German codes, cannot be overstated. It provided a feedback loop that let deception planners monitor in real time how the Germans were interpreting their planted information. When a fake message about troop movements appeared in decoded German communications, the Allies knew their deception was working. When German orders reflected belief in the Calais threat, they could calibrate their next moves accordingly. Ultra transformed deception from educated guessing into a science, allowing course corrections and refinements that kept the operation on track even as circumstances changed. As the Normandy campaign progressed and Allied armies pushed inland, fortitude continued evolving. Fictional formations were relocated to explain why they hadn't yet attacked. New phantom threats emerged to keep German forces dispersed. The fictional 14th Army appeared in Scotland, maintaining pressure on Norway. Fusag itself was supposedly reinforced, its attack date postponed repeatedly to explain the delay. Each explanation was carefully crafted to maintain credibility, while buying more time for the real armies fighting in France. The human cost of maintaining the deception was real, if often invisible. Double agents lived under constant stress, knowing that discovery meant certain death. Intelligence officers worked crushing hours, analyzing enemy responses, and crafting new layers of deception. Soldiers maintained fake installations under the threat of German bombing. French resistance fighters provided crucial intelligence about German defensive dispositions, while risking torture and execution. Their courage and dedication, though it left no battlefield monuments, proved as vital as any frontal assault. By mid-July 1944, over a month after the initial landings, the greatest testament to Operation Fortitude's success lay not in what had happened, but in what had not. Over 150,000 German troops of the 15th Army remained stationed around Pas de Calais, their eyes fixed on the horizon, waiting for an invasion that would never come, while Allied soldiers bled and died in the hedgerows of Normandy, fighting a brutal attritional campaign to expand their beachhead. An entire German army sat idle, paralyzed by phantom threats and false intelligence. This strategic paralysis represented Fortitude's ultimate achievement, not merely deceiving the enemy, but freezing them in place while the real battle unfolded elsewhere. The deception evolved after D-Day, requiring constant refinement to maintain credibility. When the scale of the Normandy landings became undeniable, German intelligence officers naturally questioned why such massive forces would be committed to a mere diversion. The answer came through Garbeau's carefully timed messages and continued signals from other double agents. They reported that while some Fusag forces had been redirected to reinforce the struggling Normandy operation, the bulk of Patton's army remained in England, preparing for the main assault at Calais. This explanation was brilliant in its simplicity. It acknowledged reality while preserving the core deception. The Germans, desperate to believe their own strategic assumptions, accepted this narrative readily. Control of the deception shifted on July 20th, when Ops B at Chef took over from Montgomery's R Force. The new phase required even more elaborate storytelling. To explain the transfer of real units to Normandy, the fiction evolved. Eisenhower had supposedly decided that Normandy required immediate reinforcement, despite the original plan. Some Fusag divisions were therefore being sent to France, but Patton's army would be rebuilt with fresh American formations arriving from across the Atlantic. The attack on Calais was merely postponed, not cancelled. Each development in the real war demanded corresponding adjustments to the false narrative, creating a parallel fictional campaign that mirrored actual events while maintaining the essential lie. Patton's appearance in Normandy in late July posed a particular challenge. How could the commander of Fusag suddenly show up in France without exposing the entire deception? The solution demonstrated the operation's psychological sophistication. Double agents spread rumors that Patton had been demoted after refusing to subordinate his forces to Montgomery's command. His assignment to lead the Third Army in France was portrayed as a consolation prize, punishment for his insubordination. This story exploited known tensions between American and British command, making it inherently believable. Lieutenant General Leslie McNair was announced as Patton's replacement at Fusag, lending continuity to the Phantom Army's command structure. Tragedy provided unexpected reinforcement when McNair was killed by friendly fire during an Allied bombing raid near St. Lo on July 24th. His death, though a genuine loss, became another thread in the deception tapestry. The Allies publicly announced his replacement at Fusag by General John DeWitt, maintaining the fiction of an operational army group, even as its supposed commanders cycled through. Each announcement was carefully calibrated to reach German intelligence through multiple channels: press releases, intercepted communications, double agent reports, creating a web of corroborating evidence impossible to dismiss. The Germans' reaction to these developments, monitored through ultra-intercepts, confirmed the deception's continued effectiveness. Wehrmacht intelligence assessments through August still identified Fusag as a major threat. Orders kept the 15th Army in place, its panzer divisions held in reserve against the anticipated Calais landing. Field commanders in Normandy pleaded desperately for reinforcements as Allied forces broke through German lines, but Hitler and his high command remained convinced that the real blow had yet to fall. This strategic blindness cost Germany any chance of containing the Allied advance. The human drama behind fortitude intensified as the operation extended beyond D-Day. Double agents like Garbo faced mounting pressure to maintain their cover stories amid rapidly changing circumstances. Every message had to balance credibility with strategic necessity. Too much accurate information would compromise Allied operations. Too little would destroy the agent's reputation with German intelligence. Garbo's handlers at MI5 walked this tightrope with extraordinary skill, feeding Berlin a mixture of genuine tactical details, too late to be useful, and strategic falsehoods that shaped German decision-making at the highest levels. The operation's architects understood that ending the deception was as critical as beginning it. An abrupt cessation might alert the Germans to the full extent of their manipulation, potentially affecting other intelligence operations and future strategic planning. Instead, fortitude was allowed to fade gradually. Throughout August and into September, as Allied armies swept across France and the strategic situation transformed completely, the fictional threats simply became irrelevant. Fusag and its companion deceptions dissolved not through exposure, but through obsolescence. On September 28, 1944, nearly 4 months after D-Day, fortitude was officially concluded. By then, Allied forces had liberated Paris, crossed the Seine, and were driving toward Germany's borders. The deception had served its purpose magnificently, buying time and space for the invasion to succeed. In the final accounting, historians would estimate that fortitude kept approximately 19 German divisions away from Normandy during the critical first weeks of the campaign, forces that, if committed to the actual battle, might have turned the tide against the invaders. The impact of these absent divisions cannot be overstated. During the brutal fighting in the Bocage country of Normandy, where every hedgerow became a fortress and every village a battlefield, Allied forces struggled against determined German resistance. The campaign that planners hoped would last days stretched into weeks. Casualties mounted alarmingly. If the 15th Army's fresh panzer divisions had arrived in those first crucial days, the consequences could have been catastrophic. Beach defenses might have held. The fragile Allied lodgment could have been split and destroyed piecemeal. The invasion might have failed, setting back the liberation of Europe by months or even years, with incalculable consequences for the war's outcome and the shape of post-war Europe. Instead, by the time German high command finally accepted that Normandy was the only invasion, Allied engineers had established the Mulberry Harbors, artificial ports that allowed massive quantities of supplies and reinforcements to flow directly onto the beaches. The logistical advantage shifted decisively to the Allies. When German armored reserves finally received permission to move toward Normandy, they faced a gauntlet of Allied fighter bombers that harassed them every mile of the journey. Roads became death traps, vehicles burned in their hundreds, units that might have arrived in days took weeks, bleeding strength with every kilometer. The lessons of Operation Fortitude resonated far beyond World War II. In the decades that followed, military strategists studied the operation obsessively, seeking to understand how such an elaborate deception had succeeded so completely. The Cold War superpowers incorporated Fortitude's principles into their own doctrines. The Soviet Union, already predisposed toward maskirovka, military deception, drew inspiration from Allied successes. American and NATO planners developed elaborate contingency plans that included deception operations as integral components of military strategy. The technological dimensions of Fortitude influenced post-war military development. The success of inflatable decoys led to continued investment in dummy equipment and camouflage technology. Electronic warfare emerged as a discipline partly from the radio deception techniques pioneered during Fortitude. The integration of signals intelligence with deception planning, so brilliantly executed through Ultra, became standard practice. Modern concepts like information warfare and cyber operations trace their lineage partly to those days when radio operators transmitted false messages and double agents shaped enemy perceptions. Perhaps most significantly, Fortitude validated the principle that wars could be won through intellect as much as firepower. In an era increasingly dominated by industrial-scale violence, strategic bombing, mechanized warfare, weapons of unprecedented, destructive power, Operation Fortitude proved that creativity and cunning retained decisive importance. A well-conceived deception, properly executed and supported, could achieve objectives impossible through direct military action. This realization influenced post-war military education, leading to greater emphasis on strategic thinking, intelligence operations, and unconventional warfare. The individuals who planned and executed Fortitude emerged from the war as unsung heroes. Unlike battlefield commanders whose victories were celebrated publicly, deception planners worked in permanent obscurity. Many aspects of Operation Fortitude remained classified for decades after the war's end. John Bevan and the London Controlling Section continued their work in complete secrecy. Colonel David Strangeways, whose revisions had sharpened Fortitude into its final brilliant form, returned to civilian life without public recognition. The 20 committee's officers, who had orchestrated the double agent network, saw their achievements buried under Official Secrets Act restrictions. Juan Pujol Garcia, Agent Garbo, perhaps epitomized this anonymous heroism. After the war, he disappeared into obscurity, his wartime service unknown even to his family for decades. The Germans, never learning his true role, actually awarded him the Iron Cross for his supposed intelligence work on their behalf. The British simultaneously awarded him the Member of the Order of the British Empire for his actual service to the Allied cause. He remains possibly the only person to receive decorations from both sides in World War II. His story only became public in the 1980s, when historians finally received clearance to examine wartime deception records. The ethical dimensions of Operation Fortitude raised questions that persist in intelligence and military circles. The operation required maintaining elaborate falsehoods, manipulating individuals who believed themselves to be serving their country, and exploiting human cognitive biases and cultural assumptions. Some of the double agents operated under threat of execution, their cooperation coerced rather than freely given. The operation involved deceiving not just enemies, but also allies, civilian populations in Britain who observed mysterious military activities without understanding their true purpose. Friendly governments kept ignorant of the deception's extent, even Allied soldiers who trained alongside dummy equipment without knowing its real function. Yet few would dispute the moral calculus. Operation Fortitude saved lives, Allied lives that would have been lost in a failed invasion, but also German lives that would have been spent defending against it. The operation shortened the war, reducing the overall toll of violence and suffering. It contributed to the defeat of one of history's most evil regimes, without requiring additional bloodshed. If deception could achieve these outcomes, was it not morally superior to brute force? These questions continue to resonate in contemporary debates about intelligence ethics, the limits of acceptable deception in warfare, and the balance between transparency and operational security. The German failure to detect or counter Fortitude also merited examination. German intelligence services, particularly the Abwehr and later the Reich Security Main Office, were sophisticated organizations staffed by capable professionals. How had they been so thoroughly deceived? Part of the answer lay in organizational dysfunction. Multiple competing intelligence agencies produced conflicting assessments. Personal rivalries and ideological considerations influenced analysis. Hitler's own strategic preconceptions overrode contradictory evidence. The German command structure, nominally unified but actually fragmented by personal loyalties and bureaucratic territories, proved incapable of coordinating an effective response. More fundamentally, the Germans fell victim to confirmation bias on a massive scale. Having decided that Pas-de-Calais was the logical invasion point, it was the shortest crossing, closest to Germany, and aligned with the most direct path to the Reich's heartland, they sought evidence supporting this conclusion while dismissing alternatives. When intelligence suggested otherwise, analysts rationalized it away. This psychological trap, combined with the Allies' meticulous attention to detail in their deception, created a perfect storm of strategic blindness. The technical brilliance of the deception also deserves recognition. The inflatable tanks that fooled German reconnaissance represented cutting-edge materials science and engineering, creating rubber structures that could be inflated to resemble 30-ton Sherman tanks, yet folded into packages light enough for a few men to carry, required innovation under pressure. The dummy landing craft had to bob convincingly in harbor waters, maintaining their appearance through changing weather and tides. Radio deception demanded not just transmitting false messages, but replicating the subtle patterns and rhythms of real military communications, a task requiring both technical expertise and psychological insight. The coordination of these disparate elements into a coherent whole represented an organizational achievement rivaling the military campaign itself. Fortitude required synchronizing the activities of intelligence services, military units, engineering corps, signals, specialists, and diplomatic channels across multiple nations and organizations. Each element had to support and reinforce the others without creating contradictions that might expose the deception. The margin for error was infinitesimal. A single significant mistake could unravel months of careful preparation. That such coordination was achieved during wartime, under conditions of stress and uncertainty, with imperfect communication systems and constant threat of enemy action, borders on the miraculous. The legacy of Operation Fortitude extends far beyond the beaches of Normandy, reaching into the very essence of modern warfare and strategic thinking. What began as an audacious gamble, inflatable tanks, phantom armies, and carefully orchestrated lies, evolved into proof that imagination and intellect could rival the destructive power of bombs and bullets. The operation demonstrated that victory sometimes belongs not to those with the most firepower, but to those who understand the human mind, exploit its weaknesses, and shape the perception of reality itself. In the shadows of that June morning in 1944, when Allied soldiers stormed ashore while German reserves sat frozen by false intelligence, the future of warfare was rewritten. Fortitude proved that information could be weaponized, that deception could save more lives than any direct assault, and that the greatest battles might be won before a single shot is fired. The architects of this masterpiece, the double agents, risking execution, the planners working in secrecy, the soldiers maintaining dummy installations, created something that transcended tactical success and became a symbol of human ingenuity, triumphing over tyranny through means the enemy never anticipated. Today, when military strategists study cyber warfare, information operations, and strategic deception, they trace their lineage back to those fields in Kent where rubber tanks fooled an empire, to those radio stations where phantom armies spoke into existence, and to those brave individuals who lived double lives to sell a magnificent lie. Operation Fortitude's enduring lesson is not merely that deception works, but that creativity, patience, and understanding human nature can achieve what brute force cannot. The transformation from ridicule to respect was complete. What might once have seemed like tricks and games became recognized as a sophisticated art form capable of altering the course of history. The invasion of Normandy succeeded, not just because of the courage of soldiers on those beaches, but because months earlier, in planning rooms and intelligence offices, a group of visionaries dared to believe that the greatest weapon they possessed was not steel or explosives, but the power to make their enemy believe a story that existed only in imagination. That legacy endures, reminding us that wars are won not only by those who fight the hardest, but by those who think the deepest, plan the most meticulously, and understand that sometimes the most powerful force on any battlefield is a well-crafted illusion.